tall. "I do know nahem, mahem, sia, je nahem ba'eshend, gaham ba'e, zafia dan sash ten temtun, ba'yo ba'ayo, dehao to try hum, ba'hia ha, de try hun temtem, nahio to try hum, ten to me, ihol, to tari an." The parking lot of Brenning's Fine Catherine was nevevin mumeverings. I nafries nai tai. So when I pulled in just before 8 o'clock to drop off the vendor contracts my assistant had accidentally left in my car, I expected to see the usual delivery trucks backed up to the kitchen bay, prep staff moving between buildings, the low hum of a facility that had learned to run on its own rhythm long before the sun came up. What I didn't expect was Fletcher. Fletcher Dowd had worked our grounds and maintenance for 14 years. He was 62, a man of very few words and very deliberate ones, the kind of person who never spoke unless the speaking mattered. He was crouched beside the east entrance, doing something with a junction box when my car came around the corner. He stood up the moment he saw my headlights. Not slowly. He stood the way a person stands when they've been waiting for something to happen, and they're not sure if this is it. I rolled down my window before he reached me. He leaned in close, the way people do when they don't want to be overheard even when there's no one else around. He said, "Miss Vivienne, don't go in through the front. Don't let your car be seen from the second-floor windows." I looked past him at the building. The conference room lights were on. That room was not used on Tuesday mornings. Our staff planning meetings happened on Wednesdays. Our board calls happened on Thursdays. On Tuesday mornings, that room sat dark. I asked him what was going on. He said, "I've been here since 6. There are people in that room who don't belong here, and I think you should hear what they're saying before you let them know you're here." I don't know every reason why I listened to him. Part of it was 31 years of learning to read the people around you, learning whose instincts to trust. Part of it was the look on his face, which was not alarmed exactly, but careful in the way that careful people get when they've seen something they can't unsee, and they're not sure what to do with it. I moved the car to the far side of the lot, behind the linen storage building, where it wouldn't be visible from the street or the second floor. Fletcher led me in through the loading bay, up the back stairwell that the kitchen staff used for linen transport, and stopped me at the landing just below the second-floor hallway. The conference room door was not fully closed. I heard my business partner's voice first. "Sydney, 22 years. We had built this company from a rented commercial kitchen and a single refrigerated van, and his name was on the lease alongside mine from the first day." His voice was low and even, the way it got when he was managing a room, steering it toward a conclusion he had already decided. Then I heard the other voice, Dexter Crane, our operations director, hired 4 years ago on Sydney's recommendation, given full access to our client database, our logistics systems, our pricing models, on Sydney's assurance that Dexter was the kind of person you built a company's next chapter around. Dexter was saying that the transition window was narrow. He said the best time to execute was before the anniversary gala, because after that, the optics would shift and the board would want a formal valuation process. He said if they waited past this weekend, the whole arrangement would take another 6 months minimum. Sydney said something I couldn't make out clearly. Dexter again. He said that Harlow Hospitality Group had already agreed to the acquisition price in principle. He said they understood the company was being presented as a going concern in moderate decline due to leadership age and market repositioning challenges. He said those were the words he had used. Leadership age. I was 63 years old. I had been running Brennan's Fine Catering since I was 32. I had never once been described as a liability until that morning, and I was hearing it from a man whose salary I had signed for 47 consecutive months. Sydney said, "What's the number they're accepting?" Dexter said 4.2. Sydney was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And what is it actually worth?" Dexter said, "Independently, 8.5. But she won't commission an independent valuation in the next 5 days. There's no reason she would." A long pause, then a third voice. Quieter. A woman. I knew it immediately. Renata. Dexter's wife, who had joined our event coordination team 18 months ago at Dexter's suggestion, who I had liked genuinely, who had asked me once over coffee about how I had managed the early years of building something from nothing, who had seemed like she actually wanted to know the answer. Renata said, "Dexter, she built this place. She's been in it since before we were married." Dexter said, "Renata." She said, "I'm just saying I don't feel easy about the way it's framed." Dexter said, "The framing is accurate. The company is in a transition. That's not untrue." Renata said very quietly, "The framing isn't what I mean." Silence. Then Dexter said, "You don't need to feel easy about it. You need to not say anything to Vivienne before Saturday. That's the only thing I'm asking." Nothing from Renata. Nothing from Sydney. I stood against the wall of that stairwell for longer than I should have, probably. Fletcher kept his hand near my elbow without touching it, the way someone does when they're ready to catch something but hoping they won't need to. I thought about 1993. Sydney and I sitting across from a loan officer who had told us that our concept was unproven, and our collateral was insufficient, and our projected revenue model was optimistic. Sydney had leaned forward and said, "Every number in that projection is conservative. We built in room to be wrong, and we're not going to be wrong. We had gotten the loan. We had not been wrong." I thought about 2001, after the September collapse in the events industry, when we'd held on through 4 months of canceled contracts and renegotiated everything we could renegotiate. Sydney had called me at 11 at night to talk through the numbers. We had talked until 2 in the morning, sitting on opposite ends of a phone line, holding the whole thing together by the act of thinking through it together. I thought about the man in that conference room saying 4.2 when the real number was 8.5. I walked back down the stairs and out through the kitchen and sat in my car behind the linen building. The morning was clear and cold. One of those late October days that smells like the year is making its final preparations. I sat for a long time without moving. Then I called my attorney. Her name is Claudette Marsh. She has handled my business legal matters for 17 years, and she is a quality I have always valued above everything else. She does not panic, and she does not waste time on what cannot be changed. She listened to me without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then she said, "Don't sign anything. Don't confront anyone. Come to my office at noon and bring whatever financials you can pull remotely." "We have until Saturday." I said, "Can we stop it?" She said, "That depends on what Dexter has already documented and how far the Harlow agreement has progressed. We'll know more by Thursday." Claudette brought in a forensic accountant that same afternoon. His name was Baxter Cole. He was 56, former IRS investigations unit, the kind of person who found things in spreadsheets the way a dog finds things in a field, not by looking harder, but by following the right trail. He asked me to give him 48 hours. I drove home and I did something I hadn't done in years. I sat down at the kitchen table in the house where I had lived alone since my husband, Roger, passed away 8 years ago, and I did not plan anything or call anyone or make a list. I just sat there with the quiet of the house around me and thought about what it meant that a person I had trusted for 22 years was in a room with a man who had described me as a company in moderate decline. Roger had trusted Sydney too. They had known each other before I had. It was Roger who had said, all those years ago, that Sydney was the kind of partner who would stay when things got difficult. And I had believed that because Roger was almost never wrong about people, I had extended that belief for 2 decades without testing it again. That was the first thing I understood sitting at that kitchen table. The trust I had in Sydney was not current trust. It was borrowed trust, taken out in 1993 and never audited since. I had been paying interest on an assumption. I did not call Sydney. I wanted to, the way you want to call someone when something is broken, because part of you still believes they can help you fix it. But that wanting was just the echo of a relationship that had apparently changed while I wasn't watching. What I did do was call Noelle. Noelle Brecht had been our head of client relations for 16 years. She knew our accounts the way some people know their own children, by name, by history, by what they needed before they asked for it. I told her that I needed her to quietly pull the full contract renewal documentation on our top 12 accounts and have it to me by Thursday morning without going through the main server system. I told her not to say anything to anyone about why. She said, "How long has this been happening?" I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "I felt something was off for months. In the numbers, in the way Dexter talks about the long-term clients. I couldn't name it." "You can name it now," I said. "But not yet." Thursday. Baxter called me Wednesday evening. He said he needed one more day. He said, "There's a lot here and I want to be sure before I tell you how much." Thursday morning, Claudette's conference room. Baxter had a folder and a legal pad and the flat effect of someone who has seen this specific shape of thing before and knows that the way to be useful is to be very clear and very calm. He opened the folder. The first document was a Delaware LLC registration. Crane Hospitality Consulting LLC. Filed 11 weeks earlier. Saw member Dexter Crane. Corporate registered agent address in Wilmington. Baxter explained that the LLC had received a fee agreement from Harlow Hospitality Group dated 6 weeks prior. The fee was contingent on the completion of the acquisition of Brennan's Fine Catering at or below a specified threshold price. The fee amount was $240,000. Dexter was going to receive nearly $250,000 for delivering my company at half its value. The second thing was a document Baxter described as an operational narrative. It was a 12-page internal memo written on Brennan's letterhead, authored by Dexter, addressed to the Harlow Hospitality Group acquisition team. It described, in careful language, a series of what it called leadership inconsistencies over the previous 8 months. A vendor contract renegotiation that had been delayed. A catering proposal for a large corporate account that had been revised 3 times. A staffing decision that had been reversed. Each incident was real. I remembered each one. What the memo did not include was the context for any of them, that the vendor renegotiation had been delayed because I was waiting for a better market position and had saved us $40,000 as a result, that the corporate proposal had been revised because the client's brief kept changing, that the staffing reversal had happened because the original hire had misrepresented their credentials. Each accurate fact, stripped of its context, had been reassembled into a picture of a woman losing her grip. The third thing was what Baxter called, in his flat, careful way, the most concerning. He laid out documentation showing that Sydney had signed a letter of intent with Harlow Hospitality Group dated 9 weeks ago, not a final agreement, but a letter of intent, which under Ohio business law created a series of preliminary obligations and disclosures. Sydney had signed it without telling me. As my equal partner, he did not have the legal authority to do so unilaterally. The letter was almost certainly unenforceable, but it had been signed, and it showed, in a way that nothing else had, what Sydney had decided without me. Claudette said, "We can file for an emergency injunction to block any asset transfer before Monday. The letter of intent gives us grounds. The fee arrangement gives us fraud. The operational narrative gives us a case for breach of fiduciary duty." She looked at me. "But we need the attempt to be on record. We need witnesses. The gala is Saturday." I said, "You want me to let them try?" She said, You want me to let them try." She said, "I want us to be ready when they do." I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked about Renata. Claudette said Renata was not on any of the documentation Baxter had found. Her name appeared nowhere in the LLC filing, or the fee arrangement, or the letter of intent. What she had said in that conference room, "I don't feel easy about this. The framing isn't what I mean," was not the statement of someone who had been part of the plan. It was the statement of someone who had slowly begun to understand what the plan was. I thought about her face. The morning she had asked me about the early years. The way she had listened. I had thought she was just being kind. I was starting to think she was trying to figure out who I actually was before she decided something. I drove home. I called Noelle and told her I would need her Saturday night. I didn't tell her everything, not yet. Just that I needed her to have the contract renewal documentation accessible at the gala and to be ready to stand up if I asked her to. She said, "I've been ready. The anniversary gala was held in our main event facility, the one we had built in 2007, the one Roger had designed the kitchen layout for himself because he said a catering company's event space should start with the kitchen and work outward. 220 guests. Clients we had worked with for decades, vendors, staff who had been with us since the early years, community members who had watched the company grow. I dressed carefully. Black, which I almost never wore to our own events. I wore the pearl earrings Roger had given me the year we turned a profit for the first time. Sydney arrived early, as he always did. He found me near the entrance at 6:15 and hugged me the way he always had, the brief, confident hug of a man who had stood beside me at 1,000 events and told me the room looked beautiful and that 40 years was something to be proud of. I said, "Thank you," and I looked at him for a moment longer than usual, the way you look at something you were about to understand, differently. His eyes didn't change. Renata found me at 6:45. She touched my elbow and said my name very quietly, and then she said, "I need to tell you something." I looked at her. She said, "I have been trying to find the right moment for 2 weeks, and I kept telling myself there wasn't one, and I think I was wrong about that. Dexter doesn't know I'm talking to you. I need you to know I'm not part of what he built. I think you already know something is happening. And I think you should know that whatever Sydney has told you about his level of involvement, it isn't the whole picture." I said, "How much do you know?" She said, "Enough that I've been not sleeping." I told her what I needed her to do. She nodded once, very quickly, and walked away to find her seat. Claudette was at table 8. Baxter was near the kitchen entrance. 2 people I didn't know were positioned at the back of the room, which meant Claudette had done exactly what she said she would do. At 8 o'clock, the MC brought me to the podium. I looked out at the room. I saw Fletcher near the back. Out of uniform, in a button-down shirt he had clearly ironed himself. Sitting in the chair someone had made sure was there for him. I saw Noelle near the front with a folder in her lap. I saw Claudette at table 8 with her phone on the table, face up. I began the way I had planned to begin. I said Roger's name first, because that was right. I said that everything in that room had started with him, and with us, and with a rented kitchen and 1 refrigerated van, and the absolute certainty that we could make this work if we just refused to stop. I heard people laugh softly at the right moments. I saw people who had known Roger nod. Then I stopped smiling. I said, 31 years of building something teaches you a great deal about what a company is actually worth. Not what it looks like on a modified spreadsheet, but what it is worth to the people who have built it and the people who depend on it. The room shifted slightly. People who had been comfortable straightened. I said, 3 days ago, I arrived at this facility for a routine errand. A man who has worked for this company for 14 years stopped me in the parking lot and told me not to go through the front door. I went another way. And what I heard in the conference room on the 2nd floor changed everything I thought I understood about the people running this company alongside me. I nodded toward the AV booth. The screen behind me lit up. The first document was the Delaware LLC registration, Crane Hospitality Consulting, the fee agreement with Harlow Hospitality Group, the acquisition threshold price, and the contingency fee. I said someone has been preparing to sell this company. Not to grow it, not to transition it, not to honor what 31 years of work has produced, but to sell it to a hospitality group at roughly half its actual value in exchange for a personal fee of $240,000. I watched Dexter's hands on the table. I said, and someone else signed a letter of intent with that same hospitality group 9 weeks ago without my knowledge and without the legal authority to do so. I did not look at Sydney when I said it. I looked at the room. Noelle stood from her table without being asked. She said, "I have the contract renewal documentation for our top 12 accounts. Every one of those accounts is current. Every one of those accounts has a multi-year renewal executed in the last 14 months. I can read the client names and renewal dates if anyone would like to hear them. George Farwell, who owned Farwell Hotels and had catered with us for 17 years, stood up from table 4. He said, "I signed a 3-year renewal in August. I would like to know what was done with that in whatever presentation was given to Harlow. 2 other clients stood, a woman from a regional hospital group, a man who ran a private events company we had worked with for 11 years. Claudette stood from table 8. Dexter stood. He said my name. His voice was measured, but something behind it was not. I said, "Please, sit down." He didn't. The 2 people near the back of the room moved. They had a practiced efficiency that communicated everything necessary without a single raised voice. The screen shifted to the operational narrative, the 12-page memo on Brennan's letterhead describing my leadership inconsistencies. I read 3 of the incidents aloud. Then I read the context for each one, the $40,000 savings, the client's changing brief, the misrepresented credentials. I said, each fact here is accurate. The picture they assemble is not. I looked at the room. I am 63 years old. I have made payroll in months when I did not know how. I have rebuilt after losing our original facility in a flooding event in 2009. I have run this company through the death of my husband and 2 industry downturns and a global event that merely ended the hospitality sector entirely. I have never once presented myself as something I was not, and I am not going to start by allowing someone else to present me as something I am not either. Fletcher, at the back of the room, was not applauding. He was just sitting there with the steady look of someone who did the right thing and is not looking for credit. At 9:15, Claudette received the confirmation. The asset freeze was complete. All transactions associated with Crane Hospitality Consulting and the Harlow acquisition were blocked. Dexter was escorted out through the event hall entrance. He did not look back. Sidney had not moved from his chair through any of it. He sat very still through the whole thing in the chair at the partners' table where his name was on the card. When it was over and people were beginning to move and talk and the room had shifted into a different kind of evening than the one it had started as, I crossed to where he was sitting. He looked at me. His face was not what I expected. It was not defensive. It was tired, the specific tiredness of someone who has been carrying something they knew was wrong and have finally been relieved of it in the worst possible way. He said, "I didn't know about the fee arrangement. I didn't know Dexter had built a commission structure." I looked at him. He said, "I signed the letter of intent because I thought it was the beginning of a conversation. I thought I was positioning us for a negotiation." I thought he stopped. I thought I was protecting the company's future, and I told myself that was enough of a reason. I said, "You thought you were managing my future for me." He was quiet. I said, "For how long, Sidney? How long have you thought I needed to be managed rather than talked to?" He said, "A few years. The landscape changed. The competition changed. I watched you and I thought you didn't see it the way I did. I thought if I brought you a deal that was already structured, you would understand what I understood." I said, "You could have talked to me." He said, "I know that." I said, "We have been partners for 31 years. I have answered the phone at 11 at night to think through problems with you. I have put my name beside yours on every document this company has produced. And instead of talking to me, you brought in a man who was building a fraud case against both of us and let him frame me as a liability in my own company." Sidney looked at his hands. He said, "I know. We did not resolve it that night. There wasn't a version of that conversation that could be resolved in an evening, and I didn't try to force one. I sat beside him for a few minutes, and then I stood up and I went to find Fletcher, and I thanked him the way you thank someone when the word thank you is not nearly large enough for what they did." He shook his head. He said he hadn't done anything, just pointed me in the right direction. I told him that sometimes that is everything. What followed took most of the next year. Dexter was charged with fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. The fee arrangement with Harlow constituted a textbook conflict of interest under Ohio business law. Harlow Hospitality Group severed their relationship with Dexter and cooperated fully once they understood that the valuation materials they'd been given had been deliberately manipulated. They had not known. They had trusted what was presented to them, which was a lesson in something I spent a long time thinking about. Sidney and I dissolved the partnership in February. It was done by attorneys with documents without ugliness. He kept a portion of equity proportional to his 31-year contribution. I kept operating control, which had always been mine in practice anyway. We did not speak for several months afterward, and then one afternoon in April, I received a card in the mail. No return address, but I recognized his handwriting. It said, "You built a good company." I should have said that more. I kept the card. Renata came to my office 3 days after the gala. She sat down across from me and she said she had known something was wrong for months and had told herself it wasn't her place to say so, and had spent the time since wishing she had said so sooner. She said she was sorry. I told her that I understood the space between knowing something is wrong and knowing what to do about it. I told her that what she had said in the conference room, "I don't feel easy about this," had been heard. I told her that the act of naming a thing, even quietly, even without knowing what would happen next, is not a small act. She had named it. It had mattered. We hired a new operations director in March. Her name is Ren, from a competing firm recommended by Noelle, interviewed by both of us together. She had 15 years in food service operations, and she asked better questions in the first interview than Dexter had asked in 4 years. I made sure Noelle had a seat at that hiring decision from the beginning. Noelle also received a title change in February, Director of Client Relations, Senior. There was also a salary adjustment that was long overdue, which I addressed with considerably less dignity than I should have. Meaning I sat in her office and told her directly that I had underpaid her for the last several years relative to what she had contributed, and that I intended to correct it. She told me that was unnecessary. I told her it was both necessary and not negotiable, which made her laugh in a way I hadn't heard in a while. Fletcher retired in June. At the small gathering we held for him, he told the group, in the fewest words I have ever heard anyone use to describe a 30-year career, that he had always just tried to keep things working and that he was glad it had mattered. I gave him a card with a number in it that I hoped said what I had difficulty saying out loud. The company's independent audit, completed in April, put our actual value at $8.7 million. The following fiscal year came in at $9.1. Not because anything changed dramatically, but because some things that had been quietly undermined were restored, and because the staff who had stayed through all of it worked with something that felt a little like vindication. I still run Brennan's Fine Catering. I am 64 now. I come in most mornings before 7, which is a habit I formed before I could afford an alarm clock and see no reason to break. I know every person who works in that kitchen by name and by what they're good at and by what kind of day they're having, because that is the kind of company I decided to build in 1993, and I have not changed my mind. What I think about most, some evenings when the facility is closed and quiet, is not the injunction or the investigation or the night of the gala. I think about Renata in that conference room saying, "I don't feel easy about this," and whether I had created a culture where that was enough, or someone who felt something was wrong had enough safety to say so, or whether I had made it just easy enough to stay silent. I don't think I had. I think I ran a company where loyalty was expected and speaking up was appreciated, but only in the right direction, only if it aligned with what I already thought. That is not the same as a place where honesty is actually welcome. That is the part that costs me something when I think about it. Not that Dexter tried to defraud me. There will always be people who try to take what other people have built. That is not a new thing, and it is not the lesson. The lesson is that Renata almost didn't say anything, and that the reason she almost didn't is because I had not made it clear enough for long enough that the people around me were allowed to tell me uncomfortable truths without worrying about what it would cost them. Roger was better at that than I was. He had a way of asking questions that made you feel like your answer was the most important thing in the room. I ran the company and he ran the room, and after he was gone, I forgot that those are different jobs and both of them matter. I am learning, later than I should be, to do both. If you stayed with me through all of that, thank you. I mean that in the plainest way. This costs something to say out loud, and it means something that you listened. Tell me in the comments. If you had been standing on that landing in the stairwell, hearing what I heard, would you have walked back out? Would you have stayed quiet and tried to manage it privately? Or would you have done what I did and let it play out in front of everyone? I don't know that there is a right answer. I know what I chose. I know what it cost and what it saved. I know that I am still here. And the company is still here, and some of the people I thought I had lost are still here too, which I did not take for granted for a single day of the year that followed. Some things, when you almost lose them, become clearer than they have ever been. I suppose that is the closest thing I have to a silver lining, and on most days it is enough. What I keep coming back to, more than anything else from that year, is not the fraud case or the injunction or the moment Dexter was walked out of the event hall. It's a simpler thing than any of that. It's Fletcher, standing in the parking lot at 8 in the morning, deciding to say something. He could have told himself it wasn't his place. He could have finished what he was doing with that junction box and gone about his day and said nothing. Most people would have. Not because they're cowardly, but because speaking up is uncomfortable and uncertain, and there is almost always a reason available to stay quiet if you're looking for one. Fletcher wasn't looking for one. He saw something that didn't seem right, and he said so to the one person who needed to hear it, and that decision changed everything that came after. I've thought about why some people do that and others don't, and I've come to believe it comes down to something very plain. Fletcher understood that staying quiet has consequences just as real as speaking. He understood that inaction is still a choice. That is a kind of moral clarity that I think most of us have to work at, because the world makes it easy to confuse silence with neutrality, when really, silence is just action wearing a different coat. Renata understood it too, eventually. She had felt something was wrong for months before she said so, and the distance between feeling it and naming it cost her a lot of sleep. But she named it in the end. First in that conference room, quietly, to Dexter, then to me at the gala in 2 minutes that took more courage than most people demonstrate in a year. What she said didn't have to be loud or complete or certain. It just had to be honest. And it was. The thing about Dexter and Sydney is that neither of them started out intending to do something destructive. I believe that, genuinely. I think Sydney convinced himself he was being strategic. I think Dexter convinced himself that the numbers he was using were just framing, just positioning, just the way these things were done. And that is exactly how people end up somewhere they never consciously chose to go. Not by deciding to cross a line, but by talking themselves past a series of smaller discomforts until the line is so far behind them they've stopped seeing it. That is a pattern worth watching in yourself. The first time you tell yourself that something technically true is the same as something fully honest is the moment the problem begins. The second time is easier. By the 10th time, you've built an entire structure on the gap between what is accurate and what is true, and you live in it like it's solid ground. What 31 years of running a business taught me, and what this year forced me to learn again at a much higher cost, is that integrity is not a fixed thing you either have or don't have. It's a practice. It requires maintenance. It requires that you keep asking yourself, regularly and honestly, whether the story you're telling yourself about your own actions holds up when the full picture is visible. Sydney's story didn't hold up. Dexter's story didn't hold up. Dexter's story didn't hold up. I have my own stories that don't fully hold up, and the one I have spent the most time with is this. I built a company where loyalty was expected and honesty was welcomed only when it arrived in a form I was comfortable receiving. That is not the same as a place where the truth is actually safe to say. I think about Renata almost not coming to me. I think about what it would have taken for her to decide it wasn't worth it. Not much, just a little more uncertainty, a little more fear of the consequences, a culture that had not left even a small opening. That opening existed not because I built it on purpose, but almost in spite of how I ran things. And I know that, and I'm not proud of it. The version of me that comes out the other side of this year is not wiser in any dramatic way. She's just a little more honest about what she asks of the people around her, a little more careful about the difference between running a tight ship and running a closed one. She comes in before 7 because that's who she is, but she stays a little longer at the end of the day now, and she listens differently. That's the most I can say. It's also, I think, enough.